Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the World Resources Institute webinar. We're going to discuss Mapping Social Landscapes guidebook today. It was the production of 10 co-authors with six country case studies in Rwanda, Indonesia, Mexico, Kenya, and India. I'm Kathleen Buckingham, and I'm joined by Sabin Ray and Rashika Singh in India. So we'll be walking you through this guide. So basically, why are social landscapes important? So when you start restoration, many times people think about opportunities maps. So we create landscape opportunities maps to look at the biophysical landscape. So where can we restore agriculture, or where can we restore plantations or forests? So this is really keying into the biophysical element, but there's an important missing piece here, which are the people. So we wanted to create a governance assessment. And when you think about governance, you know, what is governance? It's difficult to describe and oftentimes intangible. So we boiled it down to three key things: actors, rules, and practices. So who are the people in the landscape? What are they meant to be doing? And what are they actually doing? And this guidebook represents the first part of the picture for governance, looking at the actors. So today's agenda, what we'll be discussing is why are we looking at social landscapes? How can we map connectivity? How can we map priorities and values? And how can we visualize those social landscapes? Fifthly, how to analyze social landscapes. And finally, we'll be hearing from our colleague in WI India, talking about social network analysis in SIDHI district. I think what's important to note about this guide is that social network analysis is not new, but it's the package that we're presenting that we feel is very helpful for people undertaking restoration, because we look at social networks and we look at priorities and values and for a strategy for change. So starting with social network analysis, what is it? Well, it's a way of measuring, looking at the nodes or the actors and the flows or connections between them. So it's a methodology to investigate social structures through the use of networks and graph theory. So this has a lot of uptake in the fields of national security. So for example, if the government is trying to look at terrorist networks, for example, or there's a lot of work being done in public health, thinking about how to stop the spread of infectious diseases. Now, this is often because these disciplines are considered crisis disciplines, but it's important to think of how the environment is also potentially in crisis, and we need to use these advanced tools to map the flows and the connections in the environmental landscape. So looking at some cases that have gained traction in natural resource management, this is an example by the US Forest Service by Erica Svensson. She mapped environmental and social stewardship networks in New York. And one thing that's important that she found from this study was how larger organizations tend to be clustered in the center of the network, and maybe smaller organizations are on the periphery, but she found that innovation tends to be located on the periphery with few ways to access the larger organizations. So what would a strategy for change look like where the larger organizations had more interaction with the peripheral, more innovative organizations? And another example by Vincent McCarty, he looked at seed networks in Ghana and particularly zoned in on thinking about wealth and gender. So you can see from here the circles are the males, squares are female, and the darker color is high wealth to the lighter color, which is low wealth. So you can see from this social network analysis that a few individuals, for example, men of high wealth, tend to control the seed network. They're in the center. You can see a lot of circles in the center. And you can see a lot of low wealth on the periphery. So expanding the network to include women and low wealth could increase resilience. For example, if there were times with limited seeds or there were shocks to the system which broke up the network, it's important to think of how to get access to the more vulnerable communities. So why is this important? So what? So how do we use networks for positive impact? So there's three key issues that we highlight in the guidebook. It can be used to encourage trust and efficacy. So how can the local the local restoration movement be more aligned with the priorities and values of its stakeholders? Secondly, you can use it to capitalize on existing roles. So how can existing roles in the network be leveraged to increase impact? And thirdly, you can use this to look at using social capital to scale. So what social capital, for example, central actors in the network can be mobilized to scale restoration efforts. So going on to the second part of this discussion, we're thinking about how to map connectivity. Now, when you think of biophysical landscapes, we seek to connect fragmented land, and we look at ways to channel resources. Now, when we're thinking about the social landscape, it's important to see it in the same way, that we need to look for channels that can exist to connect people. So thinking about connectivity as the degree to which individuals and organizations are connected to each other, we want to investigate ways of connecting and understanding fundamentally what connections exist. So in the guidebook, we walk through 5 flows for restoration. So we look at information flows, so how to improve communication and information of restoration knowledge. We look at resources, so things like seed access, where the main seed sources are really important to restoration decisions. Finance, it's really important to understand how funds and finance flows through the network and who they are channeled through. Authority, it's really important to understand who makes land management decisions and who it is that can block and unlock these opportunities. And finally, we address conflicts. So it's important to think about conflict dynamics and how they can affect or be exacerbated by restoration interventions. So in the guidebook, we address 2 key methods. So first of all, we look at participatory social network analysis. So this was pioneered by Eva Schiffer, looking at with a tool called NetMap. So this is where workshops are created and stakeholders draw maps by hand to look at connections. And secondly, looking at a more traditional social network analysis questionnaire where you're considering the frequency of flows and connections. So first of all, addressing the participatory social network analysis. This is done in a workshop setting, and it's really important to consider who is in the room when you set up that workshop. This is only ever going to be a partial picture of the landscape. So it's important to recognize it's a starting point, and it's important to investigate certain flows and triangulate information, but it's a very good starting point to start to understand the social network. So first of all, defining the question. So for example, this could be who influences the seed network in Rwanda? And here we're asking who influences, because we want to get the spectrum of all the actors in the landscape. You know, if you ask something like, who provides seeds in the network, maybe you miss some important actors that could influence change. So secondly, identifying actors, allocating their links. Is it maybe, what is important to you? Is it information? Is it finance? Is it seeds? Identifying what links are important to discover. Assigning interest. So different actors will have different interests in restoration. They could be positive, they could be negative, or they could be neutral and have no interest in the topic. And fifthly, assigning influence. So how influential are these figures? Do they have high influence or low influence? So it's important to think about this when considering finally your strategy for change. Sixth, think about discussing data. Now, discussion is a very important part of the process. So it's not just about the map itself. There's a lot of important information that comes out of these conversations that maybe wouldn't come up in different forums. After discussion, visualizing, and finally, analyzing the data. So it's important to think about the so what and what could be a strategy for change. Secondly, we go through the details of social network analysis questionnaires. So these are more traditional, and issues to think about here is identifying the data format. So is this email, is this face-to-face? And when creating the survey, it's important to have a pilot or a test survey to see before sending it to the entire network, to collect the data, and then again to visualize and analyze and think about the so what. So just some quick tips that we found that are very important when we've been exploring social network analysis is to ensure inclusive engagement. Again, it really depends, your map really depends on the people that are in the room. So it's important to include diverse identities and viewpoints throughout the process and on the facilitation team, to ensure confidentiality and informed consent, and again to triangulate and disaggregate results. Sometimes it might not be suitable to have everyone in the room at the same time together. Maybe different workshops will need to be done and different surveys need to be done, but you can triangulate that data. And then finally, thinking about addressing the different scale dynamics. So how can you do different maps at the local, the national, the provincial level to really understand the different networks that exist? Because obviously each scale has different networks. So moving on to part 3, how do we map priorities and values? So like I said, this is a toolbox of thinking about not only social network analysis, not just the actors, but what they prioritize and what they value. So we do this by presenting 2 questionnaires. Firstly, a priorities questionnaire to identify common goals among stakeholders that can help shape partnerships of funding proposals. So the 3 elements we focus on are why, what are the restoration goals? How, what are the restoration interventions? And what are the restoration activities? Secondly, we want to look at the values that exist within these different communities. So to improve restoration land use planning and to understand how the community values its environment. So to do this, we look at 2 key areas. We look at resource availability and extraction, and also preferences for resources, connectivity, and access. So here's just an example of priorities in Rwanda that was conducted at the community, district, and national level in a workshop setting. We asked participants, why are you conducting restoration? And we found that there were very different goals at different scales. But one key thing came out was that soil conservation is a national mandate of key governmental organizations. So it was important at all scales, at the district and at the community scale. And it was found that there were a lot of priorities that bridged both the national and community scale at the district level. So the district leadership can act as a broker for communicating and acting on the priorities of different scales. And finally, it's a bit difficult to read, but I would refer you to the guidebook to look at the values questionnaire that we've done. This is a case of the values in Rwanda, and we wanted to look at the different scales again at the national, district, and community level. So certain issues such as, you know, how does information flow? Is local information available through radio, TV? And there's strong agreement between the national, district, and community level about this. And this is how you could get information to the different scales. But then if you look at attitudes towards grazing, so whether grazing livestock should be allowed, you can see great disagreement at the bottom of the scale here between the community and the national level. So I want to just pass on for the next section, for part 4, to Sabin, who will talk about visualizing social landscapes.
Great. Hello, everyone. So the next step after you have done these workshops and collected the data from your questionnaires is to visualize it. And this is a really essential part of the process. It bridges these hand-done drawings or the survey data and makes it something that you can actually start analyzing. So today we're going to show you a little bit of some of the software that we've used and give you some examples of how you could take this up in your own work. So we looked at 5 different software visualizations, and these are the main ones that are used right now. We have NodeXL, Kumu, UCNet, Gephi, and DataMuse. And there are plenty others out there, but this is just a small selection that are used both in academic papers as well as in workshop settings. So you see that they all pretty much do the same thing. However, there are differences, right? They're different target users, different access, different ways to access. It also changes the visual attractiveness and the usability. So the one that we ended up using for most of this guide and that we've recommended as well is Kumu. So that is really targeted towards a general user. It has an open, free access. You can use it on the internet. It's visually attractive and it's fairly easy to use. That said, there are many other options out there. So this is just a small selection of what you can actually take over and use yourself. So to actually put it in the software, it's good to know that this is not a big step. You often input it using Excel and quickly can do this in about 30 minutes to an hour. So this should not be the big lift here in this workshop setting that you do. And now I'm going to focus a little bit on how to analyze the social landscapes, right? Once you have this data in the computer network, you want to start thinking about what are the insights that you can take from it. So the way we've looked at analyzing social landscapes is focused on 3 aspects: centrality, shape, and attributes. And I'm going to walk you through these each one at a time. So first, looking at network centrality. So for network centrality, we have 4 different measures. And in the scientific literature, things like degree centrality, closest centrality, betweenness centrality, and eigenvector centrality are often used to talk about social network analysis. What we found is that when we were in these workshops, our participants didn't understand what degree centrality meant. So we started using other words like connectors, spreaders, gatekeepers, or change champions. And this made this work really resonate with our stakeholders. So we strongly suggest that you try to use similar words when you're referring to this work. So let's take an example here. The first one, the connectors. You're looking at who has the most connections. And these are often the people that are really in the center of the network. They can be a really big source of knowledge, but they can also help block a lot of the knowledge. Instead, you have the spreaders, right? These are not always in the center, but they can spread information quickly to some of the large players. You also have the bridges. The bridges are essential by connecting different networks of communities. So finding those bridges, they might not be the ones that have the most connections, but they might have a few essential connections that will be key as you seek to restore more. And the fourth part is the change champions. So who is most connected to these central actors? So that is network centrality, and a lot of the software that we use actually measures these for you. So you can come up with exact statistics on degree centrality, which can help improve your conversations that you will have with your stakeholders. The next piece is network shape. Now, a lot of these you will analyze mostly through visual analysis. Size. Is the network large enough to contain all actors, but still small enough to allow for cohesion? Density. How many actors are operating in the same space? Is it a lot of actors talking to each other, or are a few central actors really taking up a lot of that space? Core actors. Are they effectively using their central position? We saw this example earlier in the civic networks in New York. Periphery. In what ways are peripheral actors being heard and involved? Sometimes the innovation can really be happening on the periphery, so thinking about how to connect with periphery is really an essential part of building a strong network. And then clusters. What spheres of influence do actors have within their network and beyond to drive the agenda? Now the next part is network attributes. We're looking here at areas of diversity and dissemination. Is there really a diversity of voices driving the agenda? Are current discussions reaching new communities? So we provided a few different resources to think about diversity, to really measure the inclusivity of both who's in your workshop and also who shows up in the network. We looked at it in two ways, both in terms of organization attributes and participant attributes. So for organization attributes, you can have different types of organizations. Is it an NGO? Is it a public institution? We can look at size. Are these all small organizations, or are most of them large multinational? Funding type. Where is the funding coming from? Is it a local funding source? Renown. Is it really high renown, or is it low? And then representation. Are the organizations there mostly community-based or international? You also have participant attributes. And these are things that maybe sound common, but it's still important to really measure them and analyze them. We have things like gender, race or caste, age, resources, nationality, generation, education, and religion. And we're not saying that you have to measure these for each workshop, but to really think about how you're addressing these while you're doing your social network analysis activities. Now we think of the strategy for change. So this is just one example that we've given for information, because once you have this network and you've analyzed it, you need to think about where to take it from here. So we've asked these questions of, is there a diverse supply of information? Are information sources reliable? If the main information sources were cut off, would there be alternatives? This idea being that information is a key resource for restoration. And you can also look at access. Is there access to information, communication, and technology? Are there access to resources like extension services? Is there access to markets? So these are some of the questions that can prompt you as you're looking at this network to see how you can strengthen it. We give you an example here from Rwanda. This is the information network of a Rwandan farmer based on a case study we did in Gatsibo. And what you see is the farmers are in yellow, and you have the first degree actors in dark blue and the second degree actors in a light blue. And when we went back to those strategy for change questions, we found out that yes, the information network is dense, it is diverse. We have lots of different people giving information to the farmers. However, many of these messages were mixed. So the farmers didn't really know what information to take. Reliable? The NGOs were actually the most reliable. They were providing quality information regularly to the farmer. So we recommended that the NGOs keep providing that information and sort of unify those messages so that the diversity does not become as much of an issue. And what would be the alternates if the NGOs were to step away from this area? Well, the district leadership is really well positioned to ensure quality of information flows even after the NGO projects have ended. Now, what were our two strategic changes after this? Increasing the sharing of curated knowledge and measuring its uptake, and understanding the underlying drivers for lack of collaboration. Great. So I will now pass it on to our colleague in India, Ruchika Singh, who helped lead this case study in the district of SIDHI and the state of Madhya Pradesh.
Thanks, Sabin. Hello all. The picture of the two that you see on the screen is of two women, Vimla and her daughter-in-law Shanti from SIDHI district, an area that WRI India has been working to do the restoration opportunity assessment, and we've done that by adapting the restoration opportunity assessment methodology for India. We started work in SIDHI with an objective of delineating opportunities for implementing tree-based interventions at scale to enhance rural livelihoods, especially for women and marginalized sections, and to enhance provisioning and regulatory services for the population of this climate vulnerable district. Just to give you an idea of where SIDHI is, next slide, please. SIDHI is in the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh, and it's the easternmost part of the state, as you can see in the blue, pop out. SIDHI is an extremely climate vulnerable area, and according to the recent study done by Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change and the GIZ, it was ranked really highly climate vulnerable. As a district, the pictures are from the landscape. The landscape has really poor developmental attributes. Forest and agriculture are the lifeline of much of SIDHI's population, with more than half of the population below the poverty line. And majority of the population has marginal land holdings. When we started doing the assessment and the findings emerged, we realized that SIDHI has abundant opportunity, about 0.3 million hectares. However, change in forest cover and composition in SIDHI has reduced the availability of fuel wood, fodder, non-timber forest produce for people like Vimla and her daughter-in-law Shanti. So when we started the work in SIDHI, of doing the SIDHI's opportunity assessment, we realized that we can map the biophysical potential, but what was missing was the social landscape of the region. And that's when we decided to do this with our colleagues from other offices in WRI. Next slide, please. And as Kathleen and Sabin were talking about the process, we did participatory workshops, and we did workshops at different levels with one key question: who influences implementation of landscape restoration in Madhya Pradesh and in the SIDHI district? Our larger goal was to understand who could implement and scale in the landscape restoration in the district. So the pictures that you see on the screen are from the participatory workshop that we did with the Forest Department in SIDHI in the left, and one of the workshops that we did with at the state capital in Bhopal, which had participants from different civil society organizations, different government departments, private sector, research institutions. So how did we do this? So we initially started with the inception workshop in the state capital in Bhopal, and the picture on the right. And then we moved on to SIDHI district, and we initially did a workshop which had representation from most of the departments, farmer representatives, representatives of local user groups, NGOs, and local champions. However, we did not have any representation of women in that group. I was the only woman as a facilitator. The other key stakeholder that was missing from that discussion was the Forest Department. So we did another round of workshop only with the Forest Department. The picture that I have here is only of the second session, the participatory workshop that we did. And when we put together the findings from the workshop, the next slide, please. The findings were quite unexpected in terms of the results. So if you look at the social landscape opportunity map for SIDHI, we realized that it looks like a very dense network. However, what we realized was there was lack of diversity of actors, especially NGOs that could implement and scale landscape restoration in the district and for the larger landscape that we are working in. We also found out in terms of other key findings were of in context of collaboration, conflict, and finance. For instance, the district has the interplay of social and political divisions have created is a challenge for collaborative efforts within the district because of the past experiences that that people have had. There was also conflict amongst different state departments and which potentially could be a barrier, as well as most of the finance in the district is through the state budgetary allocations, and which is channeled through the local government bodies. So there wasn't many different, you don't have funding coming from other sources. So it's quite an interesting sort of a place as far as one looks at how the findings emerge. Next slide, please. Madhya Pradesh as a district, and this is the map of the social landscape of Madhya Pradesh. The findings were very different. As a state, there is a diversity of factors, especially NGOs, and I'm going to just take that as an example. And what we realized was, although the state has multiple NGOs and really well-known working in the environment and governance space in the state, what I was showing you from the previous map, SIDHI doesn't have many of those. A larger sort of SIDHI assessment, opportunity assessment findings for the district indicate that the restoration opportunity potential that we've analyzed can generate labor and employment for the district, and there is scope for developing additional value chains in the district. So we realized that as a strategy of change, there are many state level NGOs that could actually come in from the state headquarters to the districts and be part of the transformational journey if one operationalizes the CD's opportunity assessment. Another interesting thing that we found, one of the big NGOs which is well known in the state capital was working in the periphery in the district. So the larger sort of a finding for us was to tap some of these networks and champions which are working in the periphery if we have to think about scaling landscape restoration in the district. Apart from thinking about how do we create awareness on rules, regulations, resource rights related to landscape restoration among farmers, which would enable collaboration and facilitate better implementation of policies. What sort of incentives our value chain analysis indicates that could be a very important incentive for especially NGOs to pursue restoration in the region, and also potentially to break silos. I will now hand it over back to Kathleen and Sylvia.
Thank you, Rishika. It's very insightful to hear from the country context. And just to note that India is just one of the countries that we highlight in the book, in the guidebook. So it's worth checking out the other case studies as well from Rwanda and Kenya and Indonesia. Okay, so just to finish up, thinking about what would a plan of action look like? So how can you take this into your day-to-day work, or how can this be embedded within part of the process for restoration opportunities assessments? Well, first of all, this could be adapted from the current guidebook. It doesn't necessarily need to just be limited to restoration. It can be used for natural resource management generally. But it's important to make a commitment to map your social landscapes around a specific goal or activity. Secondly, analyze the social network maps to determine what works and what could be improved. Thirdly, to work with groups within the social landscape to identify, agree upon, and implement changes. So what we try to do is work directly with the communities and through our WI country offices to really think about the key networks that we needed to understand to try and implement change on the ground. And then finally, to repeat the process, like Rishika was saying, sometimes one workshop is not enough because you can't get the adequate stakeholders in the room, but obviously this will change. So by repetition, this will help, and it's important to make a commitment to evaluate changes in the social landscape periodically. And that's it for our discussion today. Well, our presentation today. I hope to pass it on to have a discussion, but this took quite a long time through, many different case studies and countries. So a big thank you to all our donors that enabled this to happen. Thank you. Okay, I'll pass on to Will, our communications expert, to help us with questions.
So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put it into the Zoom group chat, and then we'll address them from there. Thank you. Sure, I guess I can start off with a question, actually. You said that there are multiple case studies all around the world. Why did you decide to engage the Bureau's international offices in this report? Why did you think it was very important?
Well, I think the social landscape, the most important part is looking at the people within the landscape and to, like I said previously, we were doing traditionally opportunities maps, which would look at the biophysical landscape, but really to understand, for example, in Rwanda, how can we implement restoration without understanding where the seeds are coming from? Or how can we start to think about restoration if we don't understand where the funds are coming from? So we looked at these key areas to try and understand, not to judge good governance, but to understand what is the governance currently and how can we create a pragmatic strategy for change. Rather than it being a judgment, but being pragmatic.
Gabrielle has a question about the software. How do you conclude that a network is diverse or less diverse? Is that a function of the software or a conclusion of the analyst?
Yeah, so the idea of diversity can be very sensitive. So the software can actually tell you how many different types of NGOs you have and how many government actors you have. So that is a statistic it can help provide. But a lot of that will really come from your own analysis to determine, is it the diversity that you're looking for in your network? So that's something that you can analyze on your own. And the question here is there's no right answer, right? The analysis is only as good as the setting that you have. So trying to figure out what you want for the diversity in your setting and what works for you.
Great, we have another question from James. What are some of the biases associated with this approach, and how do you eliminate the bias, for instance, wrong information based on certain personal interests for the topic of discussion?
I think that's a really good question, and I'd like to push that to Rishika, who was working in these kind of contexts to try and eliminate bias and to try and get as many stakeholders involved as possible. Can we pass to Rishika?
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, I agree. It's a brilliant question. To ensure that the biases, that if there are any biases associated with the approach and how we do it, and not to have any of that, what we found useful in SIDHI was, because we did these workshops multiple times with different stakeholders, and we if the same sort of findings kept coming up in all of that, that kind of helped us to do a bit of triangulation in terms of what we are seeing as part of the social landscape opportunity findings resonates. The other thing that we also realize is, because as I was saying is the social landscape work was one of the works of the larger restoration opportunity assessment that we were doing in the district, and the findings also resonated with the larger findings. So because we did, apart from this particular workshops for the social landscape analysis, we were also doing sub-district workshops for other different components.
Great, thanks, Rishika. We have another question from Emily. Could you talk more about making the decision to focus on relationships between organizations rather than relationships between individuals within those organizations?
I think to a large extent this was for ease. A lot of the time the people in the organizations might change, but the relationships between organizations don't change as rapidly. And when we're talking to people in a community, they often understand whether their seeds come from a certain organization, but they don't necessarily know who is enabling that within the organization. The same with information flow or finance. So it also, I mean, there's a number of reasons why it would be helpful as well. I mean, it helps for keeping people anonymous in the process. And it also helps for sensitivities as well. You're not necessarily pointing to certain people, and issues such as conflict, authority can be difficult to talk about. So to make it as sensitive as possible, yet getting the information, the core of the information that you need is, we're looking at, are there a lot of NGOs in this landscape? Are there a lot of government officials in this landscape? So we can start to understand the actors, but not necessarily the individual actors themselves.
So we have another question. This is from Anne. This is really cool. We should do more of this. Thank you. I was wondering if you could say a little more about the data collection aspect. When you use surveys, not in-person workshops, how do you structure these and ensure people respond? Could you share an example of a survey with me? I would love to connect offline to learn more about data collection.
Hi, Anne. Well, great. Please do connect with us offline. So to use surveys, right, to get people to respond is generally a challenge with surveys. So when we've used them in the past, sent them to people that we know will respond, because when you're doing these types of surveys, you really need to get a high response rate. Otherwise, you will have holes in your network. So we explain a little bit more in the guide, really how to structure these surveys. But I can give you an example of how we used it here at WRI. We did a survey with the Initiative 20 by 20 network, which is our network that looks at restoration in Latin America and brings together both technical partners like NGOs with financial partners, as well as countries. So we sent out this survey to all the technical and financial partners. And what was nice about that is that we had specific names. So we were asking, with whom do you share information most frequently? And we were able to use that data to then put it on a survey. So by having really defined names in your survey, it makes that survey process a lot easier. It's much harder when you don't include those organizations already, because you get worse response rates. So I would be happy to connect with you a little bit further about that. We have shared some of those results on the Initiative 20 by 20 survey publicly.
We have a question from Christine. Did you also connect social mapping with spatial mapping? For example, to decide where to have a community hub event or to connect it with the biophysical maps?
We're only just starting to connect the biophysical and the social. We did some trials with that in Rwanda to understand where the organizations were coming from. Were they all coming from Kigali, or were they in Gatsibo? Where was the information coming from? Because like we said, we're really quite interested in connecting these different scales and understanding the different scales. And as well, what Rishika was saying about, that when you go down to the community level, having a lack of actors, even though it might look like there are a lot of actors in the area. So that's something we want to explore further. This was, this guidebook took quite a long time, but there are definitely areas that we would like to develop and talk more about, and connecting the spatial and the networks would be great. So if other people have been doing this kind of work, it would be great to get involved.
Okay, great. I guess one final question, and then I guess we'll end the webinar, is where do you guys want to see this guidebook go in the future? What kind of, where do you want to see it implemented? How do you want to see it implemented? And who do you want to see implemented?
Well, I'll go first, but I'll pass on to the other co-authors as well, because it really was a collaboration. I would like to see social landscapes to be part of the process that people use in natural resource governance. So going beyond just, like I said, social network analysis is just one part. Understanding these different communities, their values and priorities, because I think it can make for a more pragmatic way of looking at governance, to really understand what does this community think, and not suggesting that communities think in one way, but it's a baseline for understanding and to dig deeper. We're not trying to suggest that communities are just homogenous, but really seeing it as the people are at the center. There was a lot of talk about, oh, it's about the people, but fundamentally, it's the people that plant the trees, it's the people that cut the trees down, it's the people that are engaged, and there's a whole network. It goes beyond just NGOs and beyond those that are directly involved, and to really start thinking about the wider network, to think about the landscape, to think about the people that are in the circle and how they can be activated for change. So going beyond the usual partners to really think, how can we use this to activate change? I'll pass on to Sabin and then Rishika.
Great. Yeah, I would also add that, although we've made this guide really focused on restoration, this is a strategy that can be used throughout lots of different types of environmental work. So here at WRI even, we've been training our cities team and our climate team and our energy team on how they can use this in their own work. So even if the examples are focused on restoration, I would like to see this applied more broadly to the environmental movement, because we really are in a crisis situation and we need to be more strategic about our partnerships and about how we get the information and the finance and the resources like the seedlings directly to the people that need them. Rishika, over to you.
Building on to what Sabin and Kathleen said, I think that how we see it moving forward is the guidebook and the methods and processes that are outlined there can actually do change how we think about stakeholders, what are the institutions and networks that we could potentially connect with, in order to have really strong networks that can work and have identified champions who can enable us thinking about landscape governance and environmental governance in a completely different way. And for us here in WRI India, what we realized was, because we've been doing the larger landscape opportunity assessments, and SIDHI is just a pilot, but moving forward, what we realized is that when we have governance is, thinking about actors and thinking about the governance issues is really crucial if we have to get the work done. And if we have the right, if we can identify the right actors and champions within a landscape, and if we realize, for instance, from our example, at least from the findings that emerged from CEDHI district, if we don't have some of those actors in the district, how can we kind of think of channeling, some of the energies to get some of those actors interested in the work that's happening? So it does, for us, it's been a really enriching and learning experience, and we see a lot of value of this.
Great, thank you so much, Rishika. We want to close with a few things that we've been also releasing that are some more of our products surrounding this guide. We have a launch blog that's about seed networks in Rwanda. The link is in the email and also on the event page. You can also download the guide on the event page. We definitely encourage you all to go look it up and check it out, including all the case studies. We also have a podcast coming out that talks about both India and Indonesia case studies. And we also have a Spanish language webinar that will be run by our Mexico office that's about the city's program and how they used it to improve governance in Carmen. And then here's Kathleen to finish it out.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone for being on the call and taking part today. We would love to hear how you use this or what you've been doing in social network analysis up to this point, or how you look at social landscapes. I think this can just be the beginning of a conversation, and we'd like to partner and discuss ways of moving forward so that really the people can be at the focus of restoration and create a strategy for change together. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I hope you'll be in touch. Thank you very much.